Welcome to the deep dive. Today, well, we've gathered a really ambitious collection of sources, haven't we?
We certainly have. It's a real comparative journey across time, belief, geography. Quite the mix.
Yeah, we're jumping from ancient Mesoamerican farming breakthroughs, then straight into Byzantine gold, and then, well, into the pretty grim realities of modern conflict and control.
And the idea, our mission here, is really to fast-track our understanding of how human societies handle complexity, how they structure power, how they cooperate, sometimes in massive numbers.
And how they justify fighting each other.
Exactly. We're digging into the underlying mechanisms, the shared myths, the economic anchors, the actual physical stuff, the material objects that define these societies.
It feels like we're looking at the great human invention, really. This ability we have to structure our world based on things that, well, aren't strictly real. Things we just agree exist in our collective imagination.
That's precisely it. Philosophers call it intersubjective reality. It's the shared fiction, the agreement that underpins everything else. Laws, money, gods.
Okay, so that's the perfect lens for this deep dive, I think. Before you get complex states or laws, you need that foundation, that shared story everyone buys into.
Right. And we're starting right there with the building blocks. Shared beliefs, but beliefs rooted firmly in a material culture you can touch and rely on.
So where do we kick things off? Mesoamerica.
Let's start there. To understand complex society anywhere, you really have to look at the energy source first.
Yeah.
And for Mesoamerica, the secret ingredient, the absolute key, was maize, corn.
Right, the big grain revolution moment. It's hard for us to imagine now, but for people there before this breakthrough, seeing a field of organized grain, that must have been utterly astounding, a totally new thing.
Completely novel. It wasn't just dinner, it was the foundation that allowed for dense populations, for people to do jobs other than farming, ultimately for the Olmec civilization to emerge.
And there was a specific point, wasn't there, a threshold?
Exactly. The archaeology suggests a critical point. Michael Coe, the Yale archaeologist, pointed out that for farming to really pay off, to create enough surplus to support priests or chiefs or kings, it needed to hit a certain yield.
Okay.
Farmers in places like Oaxaca, they only really found it worthwhile to plant a milpa, a field, if it consistently gave them over 200 pounds of grain per acre.
200 pounds per acre, that sounds so specific. Why that number?
Well, we don't know exactly why that number, but archaeologically it seems to be the magic line. It's only when corn cobs were developed, probably through selective breeding, to reliably hit that yield sometime between 2000 and 1500 BC, that we see the Olmec civilization really appear in the record.
So crossing that line, hitting that 200-pound mark, that allowed for what? Investment?
Investment in everything non-essential for immediate survival. Ceremony, belief, hierarchy. That guaranteed surplus meant an elite could emerge, maybe priests, maybe rulers, who could effectively claim some credit for the bounty. They could weave the food supply right into the structure of governance and belief.
Right, so the material reality, the corn itself, becomes inseparable from the shared fiction of power, the story they tell about why there's corn.
Precisely. And you see this reflected everywhere in Olmec art. It's not just pictures of food. It's instructive, it's political, it's deeply spiritual.
They celebrate the maize ear itself, don't they? That sort of vertical ear with two leaves looks a bit like a fleur-de-lis.
It does, remarkably so. And that symbol wasn't just decoration. It clearly represented life, prosperity, the continuation of the community itself. It pops up everywhere.
And the rulers actually wore this reality, right? I mean, we have evidence of headdresses, big ones, emblazoned with that maize ear symbol, like a star or a badge of office.
Absolutely. It symbolized their critical role, probably a spiritual one, in ensuring the crops grew. They positioned themselves as the intermediaries, the connection point between the earth, the heavens, and the people's survival.
And this connection gets even more explicit later on, doesn't it, with the Maya?
It really does. Linguistically and symbolically. In Maya hieroglyphs, that same basic maize symbol evolves into the glyph aha.
Aha. And that means?
It became the semantic equivalent of the highest royal title, the paramount lord, the king. So the ruler is the maize, the source of life, the sustainer. It's deeply embedded.
Wow. And the ultimate expression of this is the place where the material and the myth just completely merge. That has to be the Popol Vuh, right? The Maya creation story.
You can't get more integrated than that. The story doesn't just say maize is important or a gift from the gods. It literally claims the gods fashioned the first true humans out of maize dough. Not mud, not clay, like in some other myths. Maize.
That their very physical being, their ability to think and walk and exist, is fundamentally rooted in this specific crop.
It's a perfect, almost flawless example of how a material reality, reliable, abundant coin provides the bedrock for an intersubjective reality. A shared myth, a shared fiction, powerful enough to allow huge groups of unrelated people to cooperate under one religious and political banner.
Okay, that's incredibly clear. Now let's do that pivot you mentioned, a radical shift in time and space. We're leaving Mesoamerican maize fields.
And heading to the medieval Mediterranean, where legitimacy isn't enforced by grain, but by, well, maybe the hardest material standard humans have ever devised: gold.
We're talking about the Byzantine Empire.
Specifically, the unbelievable durability of their gold standard. The coin, the solid is later called the nomisma, was legendary.
And not just good coinage, right? It was like an anchor in a really stormy world. Constantinople strikes it originally.
At a precise weight.
Yeah.
172nd of a Roman pound of pure gold.
Yeah.
24 carats. Guaranteed.
And the mind-blowing part is the consistency. They maintained that standard, that purity for almost
700 years. Think about that.
It's staggering.
For 7 centuries, whether you were a merchant in Constantinople or Baghdad or even faraway London, you knew exactly what that gold coin represented, what it was worth.
That kind of financial predictability must have been a massive source of power.
Absolutely. It underpinned the entire military and diplomatic stability of the Eastern Roman Empire. It was the trusted medium of exchange across continents, the universally accepted standard.
But just like the Olmec maize era wasn't just food, this coin wasn't just weight and purity. It was also a message, wasn't it? A little piece of propaganda in your pocket.
Oh, entirely. The political iconography was explicit, carefully constructed.
What did it show?
Well, typically you'd have Jesus Christ featured prominently on one side, often identified with the inscription, King of those who rule, Basilius Basilian.
Okay, so right away, the ultimate source of authority is divine, no question.
Exactly. And then on the reverse, you'd find the emperor, the human ruler.
But how was he shown? As an equal?
Never. That's the crucial part. He was almost always depicted being crowned, physically crowned by Christ, or sometimes by the Virgin Mary, or another important saint.
So the hierarchy is visually spelled out.
Unmistakably. The emperor isn't a god himself, but he's God's chosen representative on earth. He rules the oikomene, the known, civilized Christian world, by divine mandate. That tiny piece of gold carried the entire religious and political cosmology of the empire.
It's fascinating how they bake the belief system right into the money, but then even this incredibly stable system, the shared fiction of unchanging value and divine right, gets manipulated.
Yeah, it does. And this is where it gets really interesting from a policy perspective. We have a clear example with Emperor Nicephorus Phocas in the mid-10th century.
Focus. Okay, what did he do?
He reigned from 963 to 969. And he seems to have introduced a conscious, systematic act of financial devaluation. It looks like one of the earliest documented examples of a state using currency manipulation as a tool.
How did he do it? Did he just make lighter coins?
Essentially, yes. He struck a new coin called the Tartaron.
Tartaron. And it was?
It was deliberately made 112th lighter than the traditional solidus or nomisma, so roughly 22 carats instead of 24.
Okay, 112th lighter. Would people notice that difference easily?
Probably not immediately, especially in everyday transactions. Unless you were a professional money changer or a goldsmith weighing every single coin, it could easily pass. It circulated alongside the heavier coin.
Right. So why risk undermining centuries of trust for what seems like a small change? What was the game?
It was pure state finance leverage. By reducing the gold content just slightly, the imperial mint could produce more coins from the same amount of raw gold bullion.
So they could stretch their gold reserves further.
Exactly. They could pay the army, pay the bureaucrats, fund state projects, all using these slightly less valuable to Tartaron coins, while still collecting taxes, perhaps, in the heavier traditional ones, or just benefiting from the overall increase in money supply under their control.
So it's basically inflation disguised as a new type of coin, a way to raise revenue without raising taxes explicitly.
Precisely. It was a policy instrument, a way to balance the imperial budget, likely to fund Phocas's expensive wars, by subtly devaluing the currency. The shared fiction of stability was being bent for state purposes.
Let's stick with objects holding authority, but shift focus a bit. Westward, into medieval Western Europe. It seems like they had a similar reliance on material culture for legitimacy, but maybe less about currency and more about ritual objects. Our sources mention an intense attraction to thinginess.
They absolutely did, a real fascination with the power inherent in physical objects. And this brings us to a concept some historians call distributed personhood. The idea that a person's identity, especially a ruler's authority, wasn't just located in their physical body.
Okay, unpack that. Distributed personhood. How does that work?
Think about the coronation ceremonies. Take someone like the Holy Roman Emperor Heinrich II around the year 1000. The sources describe him not just as a man becoming king, but as becoming a kind of composite authoritative actor. An actor
Composite actor. Merging with what?
merging his physical self with the ultimate divine ruler, Christ, but also, crucially, with the sacred objects of rule, the imperial insignia. His power to actually act as emperor, to rule effectively, wasn't just in his blood or his body. It was conferred, activated, by physically holding these specific things.
Like the imperial sword, the Reichsschwert.
Exactly. The Reichsschwert, and perhaps even more importantly, the Holy Lance, which was believed to contain a nail from the true cross. These weren't just symbols of power.
They were more like conduits, mechanisms.
Yeah, precisely. They were seen as mechanisms through which divine authority flowed into the ruler. Manuscripts and artwork from the period often depict angels literally bestowing the power to act and rule onto the objects themselves, which the king then holds.
So losing the sword or the lance wasn't just embarrassing.
It was catastrophic. It wasn't merely a symbolic defeat. It could be interpreted as the actual loss of one's legal and divine right to govern. The stability of the entire realm was perceived to be physically bound to the location and the sanctity of these specific objects. The thinginess was paramount.
And this intense focus on objects, on material things defining status and identity, wasn't just for kings, was it? It seems to have filtered down.
It really did. We see it very clearly in, of all places, cemeteries.
Yep.
They became these active arenas where social differences were constantly being negotiated and performed, even in death.
How so? Through grave goods.
Exactly. The items buried of the things like brooches, weapons, tools, jewelry, often unique. Handmade pieces weren't random. They were carefully chosen to communicate specific things about the deceased.
Like what? Wealth? Gender?
All of the above.
Yeah.
Sex, gender roles, religious beliefs, maybe even ethnic affiliation. The objects placed in the grave were part of a complex dialogue about who this person was, what group they belonged to, what their status was within that group. A final performance of identity.
But the sources say this dialogue, this performance was unstable. Why unstable?
Because the availability and meaning of those objects could fluctuate wildly. Many grave goods were unique, handcrafted items. Others were acquired through long-distance trade networks.
Ah, so if trade routes shifted or a particular workshop closed?
Or if a family simply fell on hard times, the specific types and quality of objects they could afford to place in a grave would change. So the identity being performed or claimed in death was constantly being shaped and reshaped by external economic factors, by the ebb and flow of trade and local wealth. It was a really complex, shifting material conversation about who you were.
That's a critical point. Even something as deeply personal as identity and death is tangled up with the instabilities of economics and trade. Okay, so we've built up this picture of how civilizations construct these complex, seemingly stable systems. They're based on shared stories, shared fictions, anchored in tangible things like maize or gold or a holy lance. But here's where it gets really dynamic, right? What happens when these established systems smash into each other?
Right. That's the ultimate stress test for any shared fiction, external pressure. And our first major collision point has to be the fall of Constantinople in 1453. This was just a seismic clash. You had two totally incompatible cosmologies colliding.
On one side, the centuries-old fiction of an eternal, impregnable Christian Roman Empire.
And on the other, the relentless, pragmatic ambition of the rising Ottoman state under Sultan Mehmed II.
And Mehmed II wasn't just ambitious. He was strategically brilliant, cold, calculated. He understood how siege warfare was changing.
Absolutely. He knew timing and logistics were critical. He seems to have either anticipated or very quickly learned about Emperor Constantine X's desperate last-minute appeal to his brothers, the rulers in the Morea, for reinforcements.
The Peloponnese, basically southern Greece.
Exactly. Mehmet didn't wait. He immediately ordered one of his generals, Turhan Bey, to launch a devastating raid into the Morea. By ravaging the region, he made it physically impossible for any potential Byzantine relief force to even assemble, let alone march back to Constantinople. He isolated the city completely.
Brutal efficiency. And this strategic isolation was paired with the game-changing use of technology, wasn't it? The sources make a big deal of the Ottoman cannons.
Oh, they were revolutionary. Especially the massive ones built specifically for the siege by the engineer Orban. They represented a fundamental challenge to the existing fiction of defense. Stern walls were supposed to be the ultimate material guarantee of safety.
But these guns just pulverized them.
They did. The main bombardment started around May 6th. And the key thing the sources emphasize is that the firing was relentless, constant, day and night.
Wait, they fired through the night.
Yes.
Yeah.
That continuous 24-hour barrage was psychologically devastating, but also practically decisive. It meant the Byzantine defenders had absolutely no respite, no window of opportunity to properly repair the massive breaches the cannons were creating in those ancient walls.
So it wasn't just the size of the guns, but the rate of fire, the constancy that broke the defense.
Exactly. It was a combination of technological superiority and a relentless operational tempo that just wore down the walls and the defenders' morale. It was a terror campaign waged with gunpowder.
And when the final assault came, we see the other side of Ottoman power, not just technology, but harnessing human belief and fervor.
Right. Propaganda, religious zeal, promises of reward, they were all marshaled. The elite infantry, the janissaries, were crucial. They were led forward, we're told, by figures like Kafir Bey, shouting the battle cry, Allahu Akbar, God is great.
Providing that spiritual shock force.
And the Sultan himself was right there, rallying them, promising incredible rewards, plunder, status to the first man who successfully planted the Ottoman standard on captured ramparts.
And someone did it.
Yes. The sources even name him Hassan of Ulubat, apparently a giant of a man who thought his way up through a hail of arrows and stones, reached the top, planted the flag, and held the spot just long enough for others to follow before he was killed. He became an instant legend, a symbol of the victory.
The fall of the city itself. The psychological impact on Europe must have been immense, shattering.
Absolutely profound. It wasn't just a military defeat. It was the collapse of a foundational myth of Christendom. It projected this image of the implacable figure of the Great Turk, as the sources say, onto the European imagination. Mehmet was suddenly seen as this unstoppable force, fueled by an insatiable desire to be the Alexander of the age.
And that ambition wasn't just European projection, was it? He had his own very specific goals.
He did. One source quotes Mehmet right after the victory, thanking Muhammad and then praying openly that he would live long enough to capture and subjugate Old Rome as I have New Rome.
Old Rome, meaning Rome itself.
Italy.
Yes.
The battle cry reportedly heard among his troops soon after and during subsequent Ottoman campaigns into Italy was Roma, Roma. The threat felt incredibly real to the Italian states. There are accounts saying the smoke from Ottoman raiding parties in Friuli was visible from the bell tower of St. Mark's in Venice. The conquest of Constantinople wasn't an end, it was a beginning.
Okay, let's pivot again. Different continent, different kind of clash, but equally devastating. We're going to the Americas and the Spanish conquest of the Mexica, the Aztec Empire.
Right, and here, the initial clash isn't primarily about superior firepower, though that played a role later. It's fundamentally about incompatible concepts of rule, incompatible shared fictions about power and the sacred.
Centering on the figure of the Mexica ruler, the Tlatoani Moctezuma.
Moctezuma II. His power, according to Mexica belief, was absolute, divinely sanctioned. Even Cortés, the Spanish conquistador, was initially stunned by it. He wrote back to Spain describing the ruler's wealth as just magnificent.
What did he say?
He described how everything under the heavens seemed to flow to Moctezuma, all fashioned expertly by artisans in gold, silver, precious stones, feathers. Cortés was clearly impressed, maybe even intimidated.
And he knew the danger, right? He knew Moctezuma held real power.
Oh, absolutely. Cortés explicitly wrote that he was aware Moctezuma could simply order his vast army to obliterate all memory of us with a single word. He knew he was vulnerable.
So, Moctezuma's immense sacred power was paradoxically his greatest vulnerability when faced with the Spaniards.
Exactly. The Spaniards, vastly outnumbered, couldn't possibly defeat the Mexican armies in open battle at first. So Cortés took an audacious, almost unthinkable gamble. He attacked the shared fiction that supported Moctezuma's rule.
By seizing him.
By seizing the Tlatoani himself.
Right.
Under a very flimsy, invented pretext, they marched into his palace and effectively took him hostage, turning him into a captive puppet ruler in his own capital city, Tenochtitlan.
In this act, the sources describe the Mexican reaction as baffled horror.
That phrase really captures it. It was a sacrilegious seizure. To understand their reaction, you have to remember, just like the Byzantine Emperor, the Tlatoani wasn't just a king. He ruled by divine dispensation. He was a living link to the gods, the center of their cosmos.
The sources compare the reaction to how Europeans might have felt if, say, Cromwell had publicly tortured Charles I before executing him. It's not just regicide, it's cosmic blasphemy.
Precisely. For these outsiders, these strange bearded men, to dare to lay hands on their sacred ruler, to dishonor him, it was an act of political and religious transgression, So profound, it seems to have paralyzed the Mexica leadership, at least initially. Their entire belief system demanded reverence for the ruler's person, even when he was clearly being manipulated.
And this paralysis, this adherence to their own sacred rules, became a catastrophic tactical mistake.
Absolutely devastating. They delayed launching a full-scale counterattack to drive the Spaniards out for something like 7 months,
7 months? Why so long?
primarily out of fear of causing Moctezuma's death. They were trapped by their own reverence. That crucial delay gave Cortés and his small band of invaders, who were initially isolated and vulnerable, the time they desperately needed to regroup, gather intelligence, and crucially forge alliances with other indigenous groups who resented Mexico rule.
But when the attack finally came, the Mexica showed what they could do.
Oh, absolutely. When the uprising finally exploded, partly triggered by a massacre carried out by Cortés's lieutenant while Cortés was away, the Mexica warriors demonstrated their terrifying effectiveness in their own environment.
The Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows.
Exactly. In a single brutal night of fighting, they cornered the Spaniards and their allies in the narrow streets and causeways of Tenochtitlan. Horses slipped on the wet pavement, cannons got stuck in the mud. The Mexica utterly vanquished Cortés's forces, as one source puts it.
How bad were the losses for the Spanish?
Catastrophic.
Yeah.
Probably 3/4 of Cortés's Spanish soldiers were killed, along with thousands of his indigenous allies. They were driven back along the causeways leading out of the city. The only reason any Spaniards escaped was reportedly because the gaps in the causeways became literally choked with the bodies of their own dead, forming makeshift bridges for the survivors to flee over.
A total rout. But
Lots.
then the Mexicans made another mistake, didn't they? Rooted in their own way of war.
They did. Cortés and the handful of survivors escaped. But the Mexican armies didn't relentlessly hunt them down and annihilate them, which they probably could have done at that point.
Why not?
Because, according to the sources, the primary goal of traditional Mexican warfare, their military fiction, if you like, was often not the total eradication of the enemy down to the last man. It focused more on capturing high-status warriors for ritual sacrifice, demonstrating power, securing tribute, and achieving specific, sometimes limited, political aims. Wiping out every single fleeing soldier wasn't necessarily the main objective.
A costly adherence to their own rules of engagement.
Incredibly costly. They fought according to their established cultural script, a script the utterly determined, rule-breaking Spaniards felt no obligation to follow. Cortés escaped, regrouped, rallied more allies, built ships to control the lake, and eventually returned to besiege and destroy Tenochtitlan.
This difference in conflict styles, total war, versus maybe more ritualized or objective limited warfare, we see that elsewhere too, right? Like comparing the Maya and the ancient Greeks.
That's a very common and useful comparison. Both civilizations were characterized by political fragmentation. You didn't have one single unified Maya empire or one unified Greek state for most of their history.
Instead, you had lots of competing city-states.
Exactly. Numerous fractious communities. Yeah. Among the Maya, you had centers like Tikal constantly vying with the commanding kingdom Calakmul for centuries. Bitter rivalries, shifting alliances, endemic warfare.
Similar to Greece, with Athens, Sparta, Thebes, Corinth always jockeying for power.
Precisely the same dynamic. Constant competition, often violent conflict. And yet,
despite all that division and fighting, incredibly sophisticated and widely shared cultures flourished in both regions. Amazing developments in architecture, writing, astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, art, mythology.
Right. The conflict itself didn't necessarily stifle cultural development. In some ways, it might have even fueled it through competition and exchange. A shared cultural language existed across the political divisions.
Homer's Odyssey kind of captures that Greek world, doesn't it? The tension between home and the competitive world outside.
It really does. The entire plot is driven by Odysseus' desperate yearning to return home, to Ithaca, the one place where he can find total acceptance, peace, recognition.
But the world beyond Ithaca
is a world of constant, relentless competition. Heroes are perpetually challenging each other, testing each other, jockeying for status and honor, kleos. There's no permanent security, no final victory, just the ongoing struggle for preeminence. That intense competitive pressure seems to define their cultural outlook.
So if we try to tie the section together, what's the big takeaway from these clashes, Constantinople, Tenochtitlan, the Maya city-states?
I think the core insight is about the fragility of power structures built on shared fictions. Whether your system is based on divine right, the supposed impregnability of walls, the sacredness of a ruler, or even a specific agreed-upon way of waging war. Those systems, however strong they seem internally, can prove intensely vulnerable, even brittle, when confronted by determined external forces. Especially forces like the Ottomans or the Spaniards in these cases, who operate with cynical realism, maybe different goals, and a willingness to break the established rules of the game. The sheer fiction shatters under that kind of pressure.
Okay, so empires clash, fictions break down, and often what rises from the ashes or expands into the vacuum is a different kind of power structure, a more economic, maybe more pervasive.
Exactly. We shift now to look at the economic engine that fundamentally restructured the world, particularly from the early modern period onward. Global capitalism, really, often driven by the demand for specific commodities.
And one of the earliest, most brutal examples of this commodity-driven capitalism involves sugar, doesn't it?
Sugar is a prime example. It's shocking, really, to see how much it functioned like an early form of industrial capitalism long before the factories of the Industrial Revolution proper.
It was not just farming, right? It was more complex.
Much more complex.
Hmm.
Sugar cultivation on a large scale wasn't just agriculture. It required significant processing, right there on the plantation, crushing the cane, boiling the juice, crude stages of refining. It needed specialized buildings, equipment,
Which means it needed a lot of money up front.
massive amounts of capital investment. The sources give some figures for the British West Indies. Starting even a relatively small, say, 300-acre sugar plantation required an initial outlay of around 5,000 pounds.
5,000 pounds, that was a huge sum back then.
A fortune. And a larger, more efficient plantation could cost up to 14,000 pounds to establish. What this high barrier to entry did immediately was guarantee a particular social structure.
Only the very wealthy could even get into the game.
Precisely. It ensured, as one source bluntly puts it, that there were really only two classes involved on the ground: wealthy planters and oppressed slaves. The capital-intensive nature of sugar production baked in extreme social stratification and exploitation from the very beginning.
An industrial model of exploitation perfected in the fields before it even hit the factories in England.
You could definitely argue that. And sugar, of course, became the linchpin commodity, driving the whole interlocking system of the triangular trade.
Right, the trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. How did sugar fit into that specifically? Let's talk about rum.
Rum is fascinating here, especially the role played by traders from New England. They developed a specific strategy. They generally refused to buy the finished rum produced in the British West Indies.
Why not?
They found it more profitable to buy the cheaper raw ingredient molasses, a byproduct of sugar refining, often sourced from the French Caribbean islands where it was less valued. They'd ship this cheap French molasses back to distilleries in places like Massachusetts and Rhode Island.
And make their own rum.
Exactly. And they became very good at it. New England rum gained a reputation for quality. And this locally produced rum became their killer commodity, their main currency, especially for the most notorious leg of the triangle trade.
The slave trade.
Yes. New England rum became the dominant trade good used on the West African coast to purchase enslaved people. They established a virtual monopoly with it.
Wow. Do we have numbers on that?
We do. By around 1770, the sources indicate that New England's exports of rum, specifically to Africa, accounted for over 4/5, over 80% of the total rum exported from all the North American colonies combined.
80%. So this single product, distilled in the north from molasses, often sourced from French islands, then traded for human lives in Africa, who were then shipped to work on sugar plantations, often British ones. It's the fuel for the whole horrific machine.
It really was a complex, interconnected system, lubricated by rum, driven by the insatiable European demand for sugar, and built entirely on enslaved labor.
But even this brutal economic engine wasn't immune to market forces, was it? It started to break down.
It did. Highly exploitative systems aren't necessarily eternally profitable. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the sugar economy, especially in the older British colonies like Jamaica and Barbados, began to seize up.
What happened? Overproduction, competition.
Both. The market became saturated with sugar. Soil exhaustion became a problem in the older colonies, and newer, more fertile colonies like those held by the French, Saint-Domingue before the Haitian Revolution, or the Spanish, Cuba, could produce sugar more cheaply, undercutting the British planters.
So the profit started to disappear.
Dramatically. The sources cite figures showing that between 1799 and 1807, 65 plantations in Jamaica were simply abandoned altogether. Another 32 were sold off to pay debts during that same period.
65 abandoned, that's significant.
It's a collapse. And by 1807, right around the time the British Parliament was finally moving to abolish the slave trade, a parliamentary committee investigated the economics of the situation.
And they found.
They found that, on average, the British West Indian planter was actually producing sugar at a loss. The net profit was effectively zero or even negative.
Wow. So the economic argument for maintaining the system, at least in the old British colonies, had evaporated.
It largely had. And this is a crucial, often overlooked point when discussing abolition. The decline in profitability created a critical opening. Economic reality often has to shift before widespread moral change becomes politically possible.
And ironically, this economic decline led some planters to support abolition.
Paradoxically, yes. Some planters in the struggling older colonies actually began to support the abolition of the slave trade, not slavery itself, initially partly for economic reasons. They hoped that cutting off the supply of new enslaved people would restrict overall production, drive up sugar prices, and perhaps most importantly, financially cripple their newer, more efficient rivals in the French and Spanish colonies, who were still heavily reliant on the trade.
So it wasn't purely humanitarianism driving the change. Economic self-interest played a complex role.
It certainly did. The breakdown of the economic engine, the end of easy profits, definitely helped pave the way for the moral arguments against the slave trade to finally gain traction and succeed politically.
Okay, let's move forward into the 20th century. We see economic crises triggering a different kind of blockage. Not a breakdown of profit, but almost a philosophical resistance to necessary change.
Right. This brings us to the observations of Karl Polanyi, looking particularly at the crisis of the international economic system in the interwar period, the 1920s and 30s. He identified what he called a moral obstacle, preventing effective reform.
A moral obstacle. What did he mean by that?
He meant that the dominant ideology of the time, laissez-faire liberalism, had become incredibly rigid. Any proposal for state intervention, for planning, for regulation, for social safety nets to cushion the blows of the failing market system.
Was immediately attacked on principle.
Exactly. It was attacked as a fundamental denial of freedom. The argument, relentlessly deployed, was that free enterprise and private ownership of property were not just economically efficient, they were the absolute essentials of liberty itself. Any move away from them, however pragmatic or necessary it seemed, was portrayed as a step down the road to serfdom, to tyranny.
So the shared fiction of the free market became this ideological shield used to defend the status quo, even when the status quo was visibly crumbling.
Precisely. And Polanyi pointed out the deep irony here. The supposedly free enterprise system they were defending was, in reality, already often dominated by giant corporations, trusts, and monopolies that restricted competition far more than any moderate state regulation would have.
So the defense of freedom was, in practice, often a defense of entrenched corporate power.
That was his argument. And the tragic consequence of this rigid ideological insistence on pure laissez-faire, this obstruction of necessary pragmatic reforms that might have involved more state planning or control.
What was the consequence?
Polanyi argued, quite chillingly, that this obstruction inadvertently made the victory of radical, anti-democratic, totalitarian movements, specifically thinking of fascism in parts of Europe, practically unavoidable.
How so?
Because moderate democratic reforms were blocked by liberals on ideological grounds. It's against freedom. When the economic system completely cratered in the Great Depression, the only alternatives that seemed to offer decisive action were the extremist ones, on the far right or far left, who promised total control and a complete break with the failed liberal order. The refusal to bend, he suggests, led directly to the system breaking entirely in the face of fascism.
That's a powerful and disturbing connection. And it leads us directly into the horrifying reality of what that totalitarian control actually looked like when implemented, where the state doesn't just fail to prevent suffering, but actively wields scarcity and violence as tools of policy.
Yes, the Soviet Union under Stalin provides a stark example. We have sources detailing events in late 1932 during the collectivization drive and the resulting famine, particularly in Ukraine. Stalin personally approved decrees authorizing the seizure of seed grain from collective farms to meet impossibly high state procurement quotas.
Seed grain. Not just the harvest, but the grain set aside for planting next year's crop.
Exactly. In many cases, this seed grain was literally the last bit of food the peasants had stored away to survive the winter, and it was essential for planting in the spring. Taking it, effectively, condemned millions to starvation and ensured the famine would continue.
It's weaponizing hunger on a mass scale.
It is. And it was accompanied by waves of arrests. Thousands were imprisoned or executed, often for the crime of trying to hide tiny amounts of grain to feed their starving families, accused of being kulaks or saboteurs.
The sheer scale of the state turning against its own population is hard to comprehend. Our sources draw a comparison here, a really chilling one, between the conditions in the Soviet Gulag system and earlier forms of oppression like Russian serfdom.
It's a comparison designed to highlight the totality of the Gulag's control and dehumanization. Serfdom, abolished in Russia in the 1860s, was obviously a brutal and oppressive system.
Right, serfs were bound to the land, lacked basic rights.
Absolutely. But the comparison points out that even under serfdom, there were certain, albeit minimal, boundaries. Serfs, for instance, typically worked from sunrise to sunset. Their lives were hard, but followed predictable rhythms.
And they had Sundays off. Holidays.
Yes, Sundays were generally days of rest, tied to the Orthodox Church calendar. They had religious holidays. They lived, generation after generation, in the same village, often in the same basic huts. They had, as the source puts it, their own place, however impoverished. There was a structure, a tradition, however oppressive.
And the Zeks, the prisoners in the Gulag camps.
Their experience was one of total negation of predictability, structure, or personal space. They worked from darkness before dawn until darkness after sunset. 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day.
What about Sundays or holidays?
Sundays were often feared, not welcomed. They might bring arbitrary punishments, searches, or special shock work regimens. Official Soviet holidays like May 1st or the anniversary of the revolution on November 7th, far from being days off, often meant heightened security, mass arrests within the camps, and increased paranoia.
And their living conditions. No permanent place.
No. Zeeks were constantly moved between barracks, between camps, driven wherever the state needed forced labor logging, mining, canal digging. They were never certain where they would sleep from one night to the next. There's no own place, only temporary, terrifying uncertainty.
That lack of any stable point, any predictability, any personal space, it sounds like a system designed for the complete destruction of the individual, physically and psychologically.
That's precisely the point the comparison makes. It argues the Gulag represented a leap into a different kind of oppression, one far surpassing the fixed, albeit brutal, structures of historical serfdom. It was the terrifying logic of a political fiction, the state's ideology demanding the complete, expendable sacrifice of millions of its own people. #4. The enduring questions of reason, justice, and shared knowledge.
We've journeyed through these vast systems, material, political, economic, and seen how they rise and fall, often based on the power and fragility of human thought, of shared beliefs. So for our final section, let's turn inward a bit. Let's look at how some key thinkers tried to grapple with these enduring questions of certainty, power, and virtue amidst all this chaos we've been discussing.
That makes sense. That's like zooming out to the philosophical level. And a good place to start might be René Descartes and his famous quest for absolute, unshakable certainty.
Right, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. He wanted a foundation that couldn't be doubted.
Exactly. And he believed his metaphysical arguments, his proofs for the existence of God and the distinction between mind and body, were actually more certain, more rigorously demonstrable than the proofs of geometry.
More certain than geometry. That's a bold claim.
It is. But he also acknowledged something crucial. These metaphysical demonstrations, while logically superior in his view, are incredibly difficult for most people to grasp.
Why? What's the barrier?
He claimed they require the mind to achieve a state of near-perfect intellectual purity, to be entirely free from prejudice, as he put it, and completely detached from the unreliable evidence of the senses. You have to think in pure abstractions.
That sounds almost impossible for a regular human being.
It's an incredibly high bar. But he used this idea to explore the nature of abstract thought itself. He argued that there are countless ideas of objects. His example is a triangle which possess true and immutable natures.
True and immutable natures, meaning?
Meaning they exist eternally and are completely independent of whether any human mind happens to be thinking about them at that moment. The definition of a triangle, a three-sided figure whose angles add up to 180 degrees, is true, and its properties can be demonstrated regardless of whether you or I are thinking about triangles right now or whether triangles even physically exist in the world.
So the concept, the geometric truth, exists in some kind of objective, maybe Platonic realm. Our minds just discover it. They don't invent it.
That's the core idea. And why was this distinction so important for Descartes, especially in the context of the religious and political turmoil of his time, the 30 Years' War? Because it offered an anchor. If you can establish truths that are absolute, objective, and entirely independent of fluctuating human opinions, sensory illusions, or political decrees, then you have found genuine certitude. It's a bulwark against the shifting sands of the intersubjective realities as shared fictions about gods, kings, or gold coins that we've seen cause so much conflict and suffering. He was searching for truth outside the realm of human agreement.
That's a fascinating contrast, then, to someone like Thomas Paine, who seems far less interested in abstract, immutable truths and much more focused on the gritty, observable realities of political power.
Paine was the arch-realist, maybe even a cynic, when it came to observing how power actually functions, especially in the courts of kings and aristocrats. He had no illusions about immutable natures. He saw self-interest everywhere.
What was his main critique of that courtier class, the elite around the monarch?
He argued they essentially form a kind of international club with their own shared interests and common policies that are fundamentally detached and separate from the interests of nations, meaning the interests of the ordinary people.
And he famously said that while they appear to quarrel with each other, kings warring against kings underneath it all, they agree to plunder.
Yes, that's such a powerful accusation. It suggests that much of the pomp and ceremony, the diplomatic maneuvering, even the wars fought between states, might just be a kind of theater, a shared fiction designed to distract the populations while the elites in different countries cooperate behind the scenes to maintain their own privileged positions and exploit everyone else.
The public conflict is the fiction. The unified self-interest of the powerful is the reality.
That's Paine's provocative claim. And he also understood the deep psychological fear that underpins established power structures. He argued that there is absolutely nothing more terrifying to a court or a courtier than the idea of revolution.
Why revolution specifically?
Because it sets a precedent. Once the people in one place successfully demonstrate that they have the power to overthrow an established system, especially one based on inherited privilege or supposed divine right, that precedent becomes a permanent threat to all similar systems everywhere. The shared fiction of unquestionable authority is shattered, and the possibility of overthrow becomes thinkable. Paine wasn't looking for immutable truths. He was looking at the inherently mutable and vulnerable nature of political power.
Okay, so we have Descartes seeking certainty beyond human affairs, and Paine exposing the self-interest within them. Where does someone like Marcus Aurelius fit in, the Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher? He seems to offer a path through the chaos.
Exactly. Aurelius, writing his meditations often literally on military campaigns, offers a strategy for maintaining inner stability and virtue, precisely because the external world is so chaotic, unjust, and unpredictable, full of the kind of conflicts and betrayals we've discussed.
What was his core advice for finding happiness or tranquility in such a world?
It boils down to focusing on what's within your control. Your own mind, your own judgments, your own actions. He advises intending only what is present and within your power, following the rule of right and reason, and, crucially, cleaving to your own guiding spirit, your inner daemon, without being swayed by external hopes or fears. Don't get caught up in outcomes you can't control.
It's a radical inward turn. Control your reactions, if not the events themselves.
Precisely. And this leads to his advice on how to deal with the constant frustrations of other people's behavior, what he calls the wickedness of men, which certainly resonates with much of our discussion today.
Yes, how should we react when people act unjustly or foolishly? What does Aurelius recommend?
His advice is perhaps the most challenging aspect of Stoicism for us today. He says if you are offended or angered by the actions of others, you must first remember that all reasonable creatures, all humans, are fundamentally made for cooperation, one for another. Therefore, it is actually a part of justice itself to bear with them patiently.
Bear with them, even when they're wrong or harmful.
Yes. And he goes even further, making a truly radical claim. Those who offend, those who act unjustly or viciously, ultimately do so against their wills.
Against their wills? What does that mean? They don't choose to do wrong.
It means they lack the necessary reason, wisdom, or virtue to understand the true nature of good and evil, or the true consequences of their actions. They are mistaken, clouded by false judgments or passions. They wouldn't choose to harm themselves or others if they truly understood. So their wrongdoing stems from ignorance or error, not from pure conscious malice.
That reframes everything, doesn't it? If you view the Mexica fighting a limited war, or the sugar planters driven by greed, or even Stalin imposing famine, not as purely evil actors, but as deeply flawed, mistaken beings acting out of ignorance or corrupted reason, it changes your emotional response.
It allows for a kind of detached pity rather than burning rage. It doesn't excuse the actions, but it changes the diagnosis from inherent evil to a kind of profound, tragic error. This understanding, Aurelius believed, helps you maintain your own tranquility and focus on your own duty to act virtuously regardless of others' failings.
It's the ultimate strategy for personal resilience, maybe. Retreating to the little part of thyself, as he says, keeping free from the distractions and outrages of the world, recognizing your role as a mortal, rational, sociable creature, and just doing your part correctly.
Exactly. It's a powerful internal mechanism for stability when all the external shared fictions, the guarantees of the gods, the permanence of empires, the value of money, the justice of kings inevitably prove fragile or fail altogether.
Wow. We've covered an enormous amount of ground today. We've traced this thread from the very beginnings of complex society, seeing how humans move beyond simple cooperation by essentially inventing and enforcing shared fictions.
Fictions rooted sometimes in the earth itself, like the fertility of maize, sometimes in the allure of a material standard like Byzantine gold, or sometimes in abstract ideologies like the absolute free market or the necessity of revolution.
We've seen how these shared beliefs build empires, structure economies, and justify both cooperation and horrific conflict.
Absolutely. This whole deep dive, I think, really underscores that fundamental point.
Yeah.
Whether you're looking at an Olmec priest interpreting the harvest, Mehmet the Conqueror aiming for Rome, a desperate sugar trader calculating profit and loss on human lives, or a 20th century political theorist grappling with freedom and control.
Yeah.
The engine driving so much of human history is this complex, often contradictory interplay between systems of belief, economic pressures, and shifting ideas about justice.
Systems that are constantly being defined, challenged, and redefined by both tangible material realities, the food we eat, the objects we value, the currency we trade, and the powerful, intangible myths we tell ourselves about divine mandates, about natural rights, about progress, about freedom.
The material and the imagined constantly shaping each other.
Which leaves us, and you, the listener, with a pretty significant question to chew on, I think. Something maybe to explore on your own. Given the absolutely immense power that these shared ideas, call them myths, call them laws, ideologies, religions, economic theories, whatever, given the power they have to literally shape the world we live in.
What is the most powerful intersubjective reality, the most potent shared fiction that dominates your life today?
And perhaps just as importantly, how aware are we of its influence? How aware are we of its potential fragility?
Because becoming aware of how our reality is constructed, how much of it rests on agreement, that awareness is really the first step toward understanding the world and maybe even changing it.
Definitely plenty to think about there. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.